Okay, I'd like to also thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to give a nano talk in the Nano Centre. For those of you who don't know me, I'm from Perth, Western Australia. There's the picture. This is joint work with Irene Pivotto, who many of the locals will know with fondness. She says hi, but she couldn't come because she's got a 1-year-old running around the house and a -6-month-old in preparation. So, okay. So this is a small sort of offshoot of a bigger project that we're doing. We sort of came across a paper and just followed our nose, and we ended up here. So we're looking at Hamilton cycles in cubic graphs. In particular, we're going to look at Hamilton cycles in cubic planar graphs. And there's an example of a cubic graph that is also planar. And there's an example of a Hamilton cycle in that cubic planar graph. And there are 29 others, making a total of 30 Hamilton cycles. Okay. While we were working on this other problem, we came across a paper by Gek Cha, who's at the University of Malaya in Malaysia, and Carsten Thomason. And they asked the question, if you have a Hamiltonian cubic graph, then how many Hamilton cycles can it have, and how many Hamiltonian cycles must it have? Okay, of course, the most famous answer to this question is when you have no adjectives at all, and then if a cubic graph has 1 Hamilton cycle, then it must have at least 3. So it can't have 1 or 2. Okay, in their paper, they inserted a variety of adjectives, and they were to do with connectivity and planarity. So they went through a range of things and put 5 problems in their paper, and Irene and I have looked at all of the 5 problems. We have sort of progress on several of them, but rather than sort of give you a quick rush through all the results, I thought I would look more deeply at one of them. So here's the problem. Is there a planar, cubic, cyclically 5-edge connected graph with 4 n vertices that contains more longest cycles than the generalized Petersen graph P2N2? So cyclic connectivity is a connectivity condition. A cubic graph can't be more than 3 connected, so we sort of refine the concept of connectivity by saying we're only going to forbid cuts that sort of separate the graph into 2 substantial chunks. And substantial chunks means has a cycle in each side. If you have these cuts, then in some sense you feel like the graph is being built up from smaller ones, and it's not an indecomposable object. The generalized Petersen graphs, so that's, you start with, well, P, M, K in general, start with an M cycle, put M vertices, 1 each for the outer M cycle, then join each vertex in the inner cycle, well, it's not a cycle, the inner collection, to the 1K vertices along. Okay? And so that particular drawing is P10-2, and of course P10-2 is just the dodecahedron again, but it's now drawn not plane, but of course it's still a planar graph. Okay, Hamiltonicity, the generalized Petersen graphs, lots of people have studied their Hamiltonicity. Alan Schwenk proved that it really depends on the congruence of n mod 3, and you either get, well, you've got these expressions to do with Fibonacci numbers and a little extra term for particular congruence values. Okay, so obviously Cha and Thomason asked this question because they felt that these graphs have lots of Hamilton cycles. So the question is, can you beat this family of graphs? Well, first thing to do is to actually just gather some computational data and see whether these things are actually good. So up to 40 vertices, these are numbers of graphs. This is the maximum number of Hamilton cycles. And the generalized Petersen graph is winning most of the time, except suddenly it stops winning at 40 vertices. So there's something better than P22. Well, obviously, we want to turn this single example into into an infinite family. There it is. Sage can draw it. So given that drawing, can we now generalize to an infinite family from that data point? Well, humans are still better than drawing graphs than Sage, so let's draw it like that instead. Okay, so there's an inner 5 cycle. There are 3 layers of 10 cycle, and then there's an outer 5 cycle. So this is actually a very nice graph, and I actually know it well from my work in chromatic roots and chromatic polynomials, because the planar dual of this graph is a triangular lattice of width 5 with periodic boundary conditions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's consider this picture here. Here's the generalized Petersen graph, the dodecahedron. Down here, we're increasing the size of the cycles, but we're not increasing the number of cycles. So this, the generalized Petersen family, is going this way. What happens if we do something else? You know, if you see a lattice graph, the first thing you want to do is make it longer and see what happens as the length approaches infinity. So here I've got 2 inner cycles, here I've got 3 inner cycles, 3 interior cycles, or layers, and so on. Okay, we need to count the number of Hamilton cycles in these graphs, which is not necessarily easy. But you'll notice that these graphs only have 5 and 6 cycles. So cubic planar graph with 5 cycles and 6 cycles, well, that's a fullerene, so a carbon molecule, or a skeleton that might be a carbon molecule. Okay, so if it's a fullerene, then it should have been studied by the chemists, and they should have given it an exotic name because they like exotic names. And so we search around for a while, and we're in luck. It's a dodecahedron capped 5-0 zigzag carbon nanotube. So, a nano talk about nanotubes in a nanocenter. So we're doing even better. Here's, this is not quite complete. Here's half the dodecahedron here. Here's the cylindrical part, which is the layers, and then here's, it's uncapped here, but normally you would cap it off and then it would be a full molecule. Okay, let's count the Hamilton cycles. Here's a redrawing of the same graph. It looks much uglier. Here's the inner 5 cycle, here are my 10 cycles, and here's the outer 5 cycle. But I want to draw it as a layered graph so that I can think about adding more layers. Let's look at a Hamilton cycle. Or let's push the right button and look at a Hamilton cycle. Here's one. Between each layer, it uses 4 edges. And if it uses 4 edges in this layer, then it has to use 4 edges in this layer, and so on. So your Hamilton cycles either use 2 edges between each layer or 4 between each layer. I'm just going to count the ones that use 4. I mean, we can count the number that use 2, and it's easy. Okay, so let's look a bit more closely at what a Hamilton cycle looks like. Here's a layer. If I look at everything to the left of the layer, I get 2 disjoint paths, which are eventually going to be completed together. Okay, and I'm going to call out the terminals on the left-hand side of this layer. If I now look at the right-hand side of the layer, but still do the right to left thing, then I see a different sort of pattern of how the terminals are arranged. So I'm going to view this terminal partition, I call it, as a domino. Okay, so 2 things come in that are connected together on the left, another 2 things come in, and then as they leave the domino, the pattern has changed. So this Hamilton cycle can then be viewed as just a collection of dominoes. You know, so this domino reflects what this layer does, this domino reflects what this does, this domino reflects what this does. And so if I want to construct a Hamilton cycle, then I just have to, well, I haven't told you how to start or finish, but we're lucky in this case because you can only start and finish in one way. Well, 5 ways, because everything's got a cyclic automorphism of order 5. So all we need to do is figure out what are the legitimate dominoes, and then we just can figure out how many ways we can do this. Now, it turns out there are only 2 types of domino. Either the unoccupied site is next to two things of the same color, or the unoccupied site is next to the same two things of the other color. Every domino changes the type of the partition as you lay it down. So if you've got type 1 on the left-hand side of the domino, you'll have type 2 on the right-hand side. Here's a type 1 domino, and here's a type 1 left-hand side, and there are 4 possible ways that can sit inside a domino. Here's a right-hand side, here's the other type of partition, and that can be the left-hand side of 3 dominoes. So, there are 12 ways to extend any configuration by 2 dominoes, adding 20 extra vertices for the 2 layers. Okay, so who's going to win if we do very long nanotubes and PETERSEN graphs? Well, the PETERSEN graph family has about 2 times phi to the v on 4. Phi is a golden ratio coming from the Fibonacci numbers. Our graphs have about 5/3 times 12 to the v on 20. And phi to the 5 doesn't beat 12. So our graphs win whenever they exist. So that's for every multiple of 20 vertices. Okay, good. We've now solved the problem. Well, maybe. PETERSEN graphs win most of the time. This family wins every 20, and so that sounds nice. But now we do some serious computing, and there's our nanotube, here's our other nanotube, here's the PETERSEN graphs doing their bit. But now there's another guy has turned up to ruin things for us. Oh, well, that's no problem. We just find another infinite family. But it's just not so easy. The new guy is also a fullerene, which is surprising because the generalized PETERSEN graphs are very far from being fullerenes, but we don't know how to generalize it yet. If anyone has any ideas, we'd be grateful. And there's the beach.
All right, are there any questions for Gordon?
Several years ago, somebody shot down one of my favorite projectors by giving an example on 56. It was a biplane.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, 56 is a nasty number.
All right, are there any other questions?
Mike?
You looked at the generalized PETERSEN, and you added layers to the PETERSEN graph. What happens if you add layers to the other ones? Does that make sense? Or?
It certainly does make sense. Then it becomes more fun. So because let's say we have layers of size, let's say we have a 7 and then 14s. Well, now you've got either 2s or 4s or 6s for your, you have 2 edges into and out of each layer. You can work out all of the possible partitions, and you can then work out for each left-hand side how many right-hand sides it gives. And you have to express that in a matrix. And you express it in a matrix, and then that is literally the same as the transfer matrix that the physicists use for colorings. And so you look at the transfer matrix, you can find its eigenvalues and eigenvectors, and you can actually get an asymptotic result. You can no longer get exact numbers like 12 to the v on 20 or whatever, because the different types interact in a much more complicated way. But it's, that's the most fun part, but I couldn't do it.
Is it conceivable that your other examples?
Well, we did 7. We've done 7, and it was not as good as either the generalized PETERSEN graph or the nanotubes. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Can you say something about the one of the remaining 3 problems?
Okay, one of the other problems was cyclically 4-connected cubic planar, and Chart and Thomason had wondered whether the minimum number of Hamiltonian cycles had to grow with the number of vertices. So they said, do we have to have at least n over 2 Hamilton cycles in such a graph? But Irene and I found a family with a constant number of Hamilton cycles. So if you're cyclically 4-edge connected, you can make it grow arbitrarily large while fixing the number of Hamilton cycles. Yeah, so they're all sort of variations of that.